Well, welcome to the Human Rights Consortium at the University of London. Today we're going to have a workshop which will be talking about reparations in the 21st century. So it's my great pleasure to invite you, welcome you all here to hear from Michael Anderson, who's a long-term friend of mine and convener of the Sovereign Union of Aboriginal Peoples of Australia. Before we hear from Michael, we'll have a few more minutes from me, and then we'll hear from Esther, Stanford, Xosei, that's right, is it? Mm-hmm. Okay, from the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. And whilst we've been talking broadly about reparations, I will just say a few words about how I came to know Michael Anderson and Ellie Gilbert from my time in Australia. My original research was looking into reconciliation process in Australia. When I first met Michael and Ellie, I was told possibly I was looking at the wrong topic, and that really I should be looking at something called genocide. And at the time, my understanding of genocide was very rudimentary, and I wouldn't have said I was particularly sceptical about the idea. I just didn't really know enough about it. And I then decided to go and do a bit more research on exactly what it meant, and lo and behold, they were entirely correct. The appropriateness of the concept to Australia I became more and more convinced of. And over the years, I moved into this area of research in more depth, and I've subsequently written a number of papers on the topic. I'm now convinced that it is an appropriate way of analysing the settler-indigenous relationship since the time of invasion up to the present. So this links to the work that we're doing in the consortium now in a number of ways. Firstly, because it brings up issues of land rights and environmental degradation, colonisation, etc., which can be applied across different contexts. One of the other ones that we've been looking at is Canada and the impacts of what we call extreme energy processes like the tar sands extraction, and the impact that's having on downstream indigenous communities, i.e. the genocidal, we would argue, impact it's having on downstream indigenous communities. Now, whilst that's a different context for Australia in a number of levels, it still highlights many of the same reasons why genocide as an idea and a concept is appropriate as an analytical tool for looking at indigenous and settler relations. So, over the years, I've been entirely convinced by Michael's original position for me, which is that I was looking at possibly the wrong topic. But in the end, what I ended up doing is combining the two. You know, looking at the genocidal discussions amongst the discussions on reconciliation, and looking at how those two played out. So, at the moment, though, it's still, to say the least, a marginal way of looking at it in the mainstream literature. And it's something I think now people need to embrace a bit more, actually. It shouldn't just be the G word, it should be something that we should use, because it is an analytical tool that's now got a rich intellectual history. And people shouldn't shy away from it as being emotive or imprecise or synonymous with mass killings. It's a much richer concept than that. If one understands the genos as being, culturally grounded, it has an awful lot to do with culture. And if a people's culture is being eradicated to the extent that they can no longer consider themselves to be distinct peoples, then it is a genocide. And also we should be talking about it in terms of genocide, not saying cultural genocide, because culture as a method of genocide is not a form of genocide, it's simply that it is a method of genocidal destruction. Mm-hmm. So consequently, I think we should embrace that and be bold about its use. So that's basically a quick run through of the way we look at it here within the Human Rights Consortium's work in this area. So I won't say any more. I shall hand over to our two speakers for today, and hopefully we'll have a nice discussion after we've heard from them. Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Damien. Yes, I'm Esther, and I am here on behalf of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and I'm just going to say a few words in terms of the reparations significance of the collaboration between Pan-African and Aboriginal sovereignty activists, because that's what we've been doing for a number of years. In particular, I met Gila.
Thank you.
I met Gila in 2004 in Zimbabwe at a National Liberation Conference, and we kind of reconnected, and then I subsequently met him again and Ellie think 2010 or so, around that time. And so along in between, kind of losing contact and then reconnecting again, there was very much a commonality that we felt as Pan-African reparations activists between the Aboriginal sovereignty movement and the Pan-African or African reparations movement. And so I'm really just going to share what some of those similarities are. And just to say that for those who are not very familiar, reparations is kind of very much in the media at this time again. There are sort of ebbs and flows. And this is being generated as a result of the CARICOM, which are the countries of the Caribbean region, deciding that they will initiate a legal action against the governments of Europe as a result of African enslavement and native genocide in the Caribbean region. However, this is just a modern, if you like, evolution of what has been a grassroots-led movement that in truth has a historical trajectory that goes back to the days of African chattel enslavement and when Africans first resisted the dispossessions that took place in Africa whilst many of us were being kidnapped. And it continues to this day. And so I'm also engaged actually in research, PhD research in history, looking at the history of the social movement for African reparations in the UK. And so far I've traced the beginnings of this movement back to the early 18th century. And it probably can go much further back than that. So what we're talking about is a rich history. So when I'm talking about reparations, I think I just need to sort of clarify what it is that I'm talking about. And I'm essentially talking about a movement to restore and rebuild African communities. And I'm using that term advisedly. Really, I'm talking about people born on the continent of Africa, but those of us who are also of African descent, who live in other parts of the world. And part of the issue for us is this whole question of deracination, if you like, and a lack of identification with our nationality. And so many of us of African heritage go by the assumed identities of actually the colonial masters that colonised our people. So whether it's, Caribbean identities or identities in Europe or African American or Black British or what have you, one of the continuing effects of this history is that we are dislocated from our identity and our culture as African peoples, both at home on the continent of Africa and in the diaspora. And so even though the United Nations, in particular on the UN framework on the right to a remedy and reparations, that reparations entails 5 key areas, those being restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, guarantees of non-repetition. We actually utilise within the movement a definition of reparations that has been advanced by a Nigerian public intellectual called Professor Chinwezu. And I'm just going to quote to you what he says. And this was a definition that was advanced in a paper presented at the first conference on reparations for enslavement, colonisation and neo-colonialism in 1993 that was held in Abuja in Nigeria under the auspices of the then Organisation of African Unity. And it was from a paper called Reparations and a New Global Order, a comparative overview. And he defined reparations in this way. He says, "Let me begin by noting that reparation is not just about money. It is not even mostly about money. In fact, money is not even 1% of what reparation is about. Reparation is mostly about making repairs, self-made repairs on ourselves, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organisational repairs, social repairs, institutional repairs, technological repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, educational repairs, repairs of every type that we need in order to recreate and sustain black societies. More important than any monies to be received and more fundamental than any lands to be recovered, is the opportunity the reparations campaign offers us for the rehabilitation of black people, by black people, for black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our minds, our material condition, our collective reputations, our cultures, our memories, our self-respect, our religions, our political traditions, and our family institutions. But first and foremost, for the rehabilitation of our minds. And so that very much fits, I think, with this notion of the world order that we have come to inhabit. And it is a world order that has been premised on not only the genocide and dispossession of various peoples, not just African peoples, but Aboriginal peoples and all indigenous peoples of planet Earth. And so that's what we feel connects us, actually. It is our common struggle around reparations, which has to go beyond just financial compensation. And if we listen to the discourses in the mainstream media, there is a narrative that is being promoted that for African people, all we want is some money, just compensate us. But as has already been described by ourselves from our own understanding and perspectives, but also what is recognised within UN frameworks, reparation is a lot more holistic than that. Now, we recognise that there are two dimensions to reparations. There are what we call internal and external dimensions. Now, the internal is what we call self-repairs or self-reparations, which we believe must precede the external reparations. And so, in effect, the internal repairs are what we owe each other, what we need to do to restore our agency, our self-determination and our dignity. But the external repairs is what we say others owe us. And that would include the responsibilities of contemporary governments, or including the Church, the Church of Rome, and so forth. And so once again, when we look at how in the beginning, the 14th, 15th century, when the world was carved up, between the so-called civilized and the uncivilized, and the papal bulls that sort of demarcated, the so-called civilized from the uncivilized, that's where we feel that we connect with many other, not only Aboriginal, but indigenous struggles around dispossession. And for us, therefore, part of the repair, the essential aspects of repair are recovering, reclaiming, restituting, not only our lost identity and citizenship and nationality, but it's also about the right to a homeland, which is something that we have never ever had restored. And that links us directly, I believe, with the Aboriginal sovereignty movement, because much of the scholarship coming from African scholars on the continent of Africa actually state that after colonialism, that African countries, which are not the countries that you see on the map of Africa today, which are basically the countries that have been, put there as a result of the 1884-1885 Berlin Congress. And so we've never ever regained our sovereignty as African nations and as African peoples. So in essence, if we're looking at reparations, it must begin, first of all, with stopping the harm, okay? Putting an end to the genocidal practices. And for many reasons, we can talk about what we share in terms of the genocide. So, for instance, a lot of focus gets put on this term slavery and colonialism and neo-colonialism, and these words actually mask a whole category of sins and violations and harms and wrongs. So, for instance, in the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe that I'm part of, we look at enslavement as being a continuum. And we look at it in terms of three distinct phases that connect: chattel enslavement, colonial enslavement, and contemporary neo-colonial forms of enslavement. So if we look at, I'm just going to share with you some of what these wrongs and violations are, what actually happened during chattel slavery. We were stripped of culture, land, languages, traditions, knowledge of ourselves and each other. There was a destruction of relationships, family systems of organisation, our indigenous economies, philosophy, worldviews, our indigenous institutions. There was also wide-scale and systematic sexual exploitation and abuse of men, women and children. Genocide very much speaks to that. Unspeakable acts of torture and brutality. The beginnings of self-hate, nutricide, which is intentionally bringing about or causing the death of a body of knowledge and information concerning the health-promoting and curative attributes of herbs, food and food components, and also intentionally bringing about and causing the death of large numbers of people through nutritional manipulation. So therefore that linked into the imposition of Western medicine and diets, a brutal overthrow of our independent governments, the imposition of the papal bulls of Pope Nicholas V, Romanus Pontifex and Pope Alexander VI. There was conquest which was ungoverned by law, morality and humanity, destruction of civilizations, the devastation of villages, towns, peoples in Africa through European fostered wars, the breakup of family and communities, the introduction of status of mother laws which relegated children born to female enslaved persons to a life of enslavement rather than, as had traditionally been the case with Roman Dutch law, the children taking the status of the father. Enforced slave breeding, elimination of indigenous African languages, a loss of indigenous African nationality and citizenship, forced ancestral indoctrination into foreign societies, assassination of independent leadership, imposition of state-sponsored martial law and terrorism, proliferation of weapons and small arms, the elimination of original spiritual systems, introduction of a white religious deity, God, theft of history and identity, executions without trial, extrajudicial killings, destruction of much indigenous manufacturing, forced labour, forced migration, importation and experimentation of diseases, not only in terms of us in Africa, but when we were in the Americas and also the Caribbean, imposition of structural forms of miseducation, natal alienation, and forced destruction of our ethnicities and nation groups, the spread of racist ideologies to justify the enslavement, colonisation and dispossession of Africans, the beginning of the black inferiorisation process and a white superiorisation process, the largest forced migration in history, and a stagnation of Africa's population. And then that continued throughout colonialism, and there were different sort of variations of that in terms of the carving up of Africa in particular, which was, I think, a key wrong that was done in terms of denying us and dispossessing us of our indigenous sovereignty. And that loss of sovereignty also accompanied with it massive extermination programs, massive and systematic incarceration of peoples who resisted these efforts, the wholesale theft of lands, the establishment of colonial regimes, military invasions and annexations, settlement of brutal occupying forces, imposition of unequal treaties imposed by the threat of military force, imposition of private property regimes, loss of land rights for women, colonial administrations, imposition of direct or indirect rule, the cultural genocide, civilizing mission, metropolitan controls of our economy, armed robbery and plunder of lands, minerals and other resources, which continues to this day, dispossession of sacred and hallowed cultural property, the politicisation of indigeneity, and also the restructuring of our systems of gender complementarity, the restructuring of African political, economic and governance systems. For instance, what happened in many societies was the imposition of chieftaincies, which ended up dispossessing many of the indigenous peoples and Africans. So much of the conflicts that we're still seeing around land today, apart from the land grabs, are as a result of this history. And of course, environmental damage, including pollution to land surface and waters, for instance, ecocide, and the restriction of freedom of movement. And then the neo-colonial phase, which is the modern phase, where brings us, I think, directly into the raising of this question of genocide. So, for instance, in 1951, there was a historic genocide petition. So this is 3 years after the 1948 Genocide Convention. And Africans in America lodged a We Charge Genocide petition at the United Nations. At that time, accusing the United States government of committing acts of genocide against the African American population. And some of the famous petitioners were people like Claudia Jones, Paul Robeson, and other sort of famous people. And we here in the UK, in around 2004, picked up this campaign, the We Charge Genocide campaign, and basically modernised it and looked at the British government in terms of its historic and contemporary perpetration of acts of genocide and being complicit with genocide. And so for us, that continuum of genocide, which is what we call in the Kiswahili language, the Maangamizi, is something that connects us with the Aboriginal struggle. And we've already heard from Damien about this continuum within Australia today, the genocide continuum as it is impacting on Aboriginal communities and nations. So this harm of the Maangamizi, of the Aboriginal genocide, continues, and reparations is part of what we have to do and where we share common ground in terms of not only repairing ourselves and our peoples and our nations, but also the rest of humanity, because we know that no nation that enslaves or colonizes another, or no people, can itself be free. And so how do we see ourselves working together? Well, for instance, working towards the achievement and securing of justice. So in the UK, we in Parco have initiated a campaign for a British all-party parliamentary commission to study the impact of this genocide on contemporary populations of people of African descent, but also looking at the role of the British Empire and how it went on to not only dispossess Africans and people of African descent, but other peoples who've experienced European settler colonialism. And we see there being room for a similar initiative, in fact, because of Britain's historic and continuing role in the dispossession of Aboriginal nations, to look at a similar commission idea where there is testimony and a holding to account of Britain, and really an examination of not only its historical role but the contemporary impact, which is what we have to get across to people today. And for us, we see this then leading into this notion of a tribunal. And so the CARICOM initiative, for instance, is talking about going to the International Court of Justice. And I know there are some similarities there that we'll hear from Gilar shortly. However, we in Parco believe that the International Court of Justice itself and many of the so-called world courts are inadequate for being able to adjudicate certainly the Pan-African reparations case. Why? Because the very configuration of power and balance of power, including these global, supposedly international institutions, we are saying are part of this continuum, in that African agency and self-determination has not been recognised in the setting up of these institutions. And just like what happened after the Second World War with the Jewish case, there was a call for the setting up of an independent tribunal, supposedly, the Nuremberg Tribunal. And so we believe that nothing less than an independent tribunal would satisfy our own justice measures. And in this regard, we actually see a true international court as being a court that has justices and that is underpinned by the philosophies and worldviews and justice traditions of the indigenous peoples of the planet, who make up the majority of humanity. And so we are hoping that our campaigning effort leads them, and we are actively organising to build support around a People's International Tribunal for Global Justice, which shall have international, national and local benches, whereby not only would we then look at our case and our situation, but also the case of all other peoples who've experienced European settler colonialism, and, for instance, the Aboriginal peoples. And so that's an area that we would see joint collaboration, because the majority of humanity who still have these ongoing grievances, the indigenous peoples of the Americas and all indigenous peoples on the planet who are still trying to regain their sovereignty and reclaim lands and reclaim their way of life, we believe we can find common cause. And we are truly in a unique moment in history where we have to also be an example to the rest of humanity. We also see there being scope for taking our individual cases and, where possible, collective cases to the Permanent People's Tribunal. And this is something that we are also flagging up as a potential area of collaboration. And then we move on to what we see as being the importance of doing what we call people-to-people internationalist diplomacy, which is about supporting each other's struggles and causes from the standpoint of what we describe in Southern Africa as Ubuntu, this notion that we are people through other people, and that our humanity and our struggles to restore our humanity are connected with the struggles of other people. And so it's about us giving recognition to the sovereign union, but also calling upon you to also exercise solidarity with us by giving recognition to our struggles. So solidarity is not a one-way street. And in particular, one of the key reparations objectives, because I've spoken about the loss of sovereignty, we don't have an Africa, because the Africa that is there today is a Euro-Africa, a Lusophone Africa, what they call Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, and the borders remain. And the peoples who are indigenous to that land transcend these existing borders. And so we are looking at this concept of Pan-Africa, which is truly a sovereign Africa that does not have these borders and can incorporate its diaspora, not as second-class Africans. And so for someone like myself, whose parents were born in the Caribbean, and the fact that I still partially carry the name Stanford, which were the names of the people who purchased my family members in the Caribbean, I don't want citizenship of an existing African country, because that's not my original citizenship. And so the only citizenship someone like me and many Africans in the continent who are also here from the continent are looking at is a Pan-African citizenship, where we eradicate these borders. And so it's about giving recognition to and promoting Pan-Africa. And so we would also encourage you to look at potentially setting up an embassy of the Sovereign Union here and in other parts of the globe, in particular in African countries and in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas. And likewise, we would want to engage in that level of diplomacy with yourselves, just like you have the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And finally, I think there's a need for us to engage in joint mass popular educational work, because we can have no global justice without cognitive justice. And we need to educate each other as well as our peoples, not only about our own struggles, but also the struggles of other peoples who share history, who share experiences of genocide, who share experiences of trying to reclaim agency and self-determination. And in this vein, it would be about challenging also Euro-literacy and paradigms of cognition as a type of cognitive justice, challenging menticide, which is the destruction of the mind, and our ways of conceiving reality. And finally, we see a key tool in this popular educational and mass conscientizing work as being a relaunching of a We Charge Genocide / Ecocide campaign. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.